I want to switch back to something you said that I'd like to ask you about, was loyalty, and working with people and loyalty, and what does that mean to you in terms of the work?
Well, it's funny. The reason I wanted to bring it up was probably my favorite. I've worked with everybody, and I've been blessed. And I'm not bragging. That's not a bragging statement. That's just a prideful statement that I've been blessed in my career to have worked with Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Robert De Niro, Oliver Stone. I'm going on and on, Steven Spielberg. But hands down, the most remarkable person that I ever had the chance of working with is a friend of both of ours as well, Ellen Schwartz, and she's the one who introduced me to him, was Garry Marshall, and who we all know. And Garry, I grew up watching his work, from everything from what he did way back when with the Dick Van Dyke Show and stuff like that, to eventually Happy Days, Mork and Mindy, Laverne and Shirley, The Odd Couple, shows like that in television. I was a kid watching. So Garry Marshall was this iconic producer, like this bigger than life human being. And when I suddenly became I was his second AD under Ellen Schwartz. She was his first, and I had an opportunity to work with him, and then on features, and eventually became his first AD. And the one thing about Garry was that there was this insane, no matter how famous that man was and how successful he was, I've never seen anyone so loyal in my entire life. I mean, the man was insane. It was so important to him to stay loyal to a number of people. And it wasn't just his ADs, or it was we had to think, you had to have heard about the Fogs. Have you heard of Fogs?
No.
Oh, I love it. Garry had a thing called Fogs, Fogs. And they were friends or family of Garry. And they were actors. They were actors that would only work when he made a movie. And most of them were older people. They worked like on Happy Days and Mork and Mindy and stuff like that.
Right.
And we would get this list every movie. His assistant Heather Hall was his assistant, and it became his producer. And she had the list of Fogs. And every movie, you'd come into my office and go, okay, let's go over the Fogs. And I'm like, oh God. And we would get this list of Fogs, and it was so important to him to make sure the family and the friends got it, because he understood that they relied on this. They relied on him making a movie for them to actually work. And some of them, it was about money. Some of it was just to work. And some of it was just because he felt it. Hector Elizondo was the most famous Fog of all. He was in every single Garry Marshall movie. So he was the most famous Fog. But it was...
he was the concierge, wasn't he?
He was. Woman? And Hector was literally in every single Garry Marshall movie. I mean, Hector's amazing.
Scene stealing in Pretty Woman. I remember he was one of my favorite characters in that movie.
So brilliant in Pretty Woman. And I did not have the pleasure, by the way. That was Ellen. Ellen Schwartz did Pretty Woman.
Ellen was on Pretty Woman, yeah.
Yeah, she did Pretty Woman. And it's one of the bigger ones she's done with Garry. And she was... she shaped Garry. I always tell you, always see an element of Ellen and Garry sometimes. But Garry, it was the most. But he was also. I remember he had a writing partner who was with him way back. He's like, Bob and I used to work at the New York Daily News, and then we wrote together. It was very funny. So Bob Brunner would always come and be a writer, and he would always help Garry, and he'd sit in the corner, and a bunch of these these older writers, funny guys who would write comedy and like hand it off to like come little pieces of paper, and Garry, it's funny, give this to whoever, tell them to say this line is funny, And I'm like, oh my God, I'm handing a little piece of paper to people. So they say this line. Jamie Foxx's face would always be like, what? But anyway, Bob passed away, and Garry had a memorial lunch for Bob, and I was lucky enough to be invited. And I got there, and it wasn't a lot of people. It was probably 50 people. And his son was there, and his family was there, and a lot of colleagues of theirs that came up with the years. Most people much older than I was. And I was sitting there in watching, and the thing I really noticed out of that memorial service was anytime someone got up to talk about Bob, they were talking about 60, 70 years ago when Bob and I did it, and also 2 weeks ago when Bob and I had dinner, including Garry. And I sat there going, it doesn't exist anymore. That these lifelong career relationships, and unfortunately, we become so transient. And that goes to when you're asking them loyal. That there's a very transient business, and it used to be their studios had big relationships with movie stars and directors and producers. They had relationships that lasted. Studios would say that doesn't even happen anymore. There's all these those kind of deals are, and certain franchises that might exist, but primarily that kind of sensibility of making movies. And he did that until the day he died. I mean, he was that man until he died. And this man saw everything. He worked in news, he worked in television, he worked in radio, he worked in movies, he worked in theater. He had his own theater in the Valley. He even did a Broadway show. The last thing he did before he passed was get Pretty Woman off on stage in Broadway. He even did an opera. I mean, at one point he was like, I might do an opera. It lasted one night.